right. Good morning, good afternoon, probably good evening to somebody out there. Happy Monday, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with my friend and fellow entrepreneur, Hebah Fisher, and I will introduce her in just a moment. We are going to have a conversation about Hebah, about her company, her podcast, Kerning Cultures, about her life as an entrepreneur, about podcasting and storytelling, about building a business around storytelling, and wherever you guys want to take it. So her and I are going to kick it off with maybe 30, 45 minutes of chat, and then we're going to look to you guys for some questions towards the end. I recommend you chat your questions to me or throw up your hand when we get towards the end, and I can unmute you or read your question via chat when we get there. Yeah, that's the plan today. So find your presence. We're going to go ahead and get started here. To introduce Hebah, she is a entrepreneur and a journalist. She's the CEO and co-founder of Kerning Cultures, which is an award-winning Dubai-based, well, maybe global-based network and media company, which is behind the Arabic and English podcasts that regularly top podcast charts in the Middle East and beyond. Kerning Cultures, their stories have appeared on Radiolab, on This American Life, on Gimlet Media, on NPR, and probably a whole host of outlets in the Middle East that she can tell us better than I can today. It's also the first venture-backed podcast company in the Middle East. It is also, one of my favorite parts of it is it's a mostly female-led team. And as I mentioned, maybe most importantly to me, Hebah has been a friend of mine for about a decade now. And it's just been so wonderful, Hebah, to watch you on this journey from at times afar and at times up close when we've worked together. So Hebah, it's great to have you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. It's nice to be here. It's nice to see all of your faces too. Thank you for having your videos on if you are, and no pressure if you don't want to turn your videos on, but it's just nice to see you guys.
Very much agreed. We always encourage those videos when we can. Hebah, to introduce you, I kind of want to throw you into the fire for a minute. A very light fire, it won't burn you. But at Unsettled, we play kind of a game. We've played it in probably 30 countries on all of our retreats, which we call speed friending is one thing we call it. And so I'm going to do basically some rapid fire questions to you and take 30 to 60 seconds to answer just 2 or 3 of these questions to get to know you straight off the bat. So if okay. Are you ready? Play a little game?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why don't you start? Tell us your full name, and is there a story or a meaning behind your full name?
Sure. So I'm Hebah Fisher. Full name Hibatullah, which translates to gift from God. And the story behind my name, well, you can hear it in my name. So I'm half and half. My father's American, my mother's Egyptian. And actually, I am the youngest of 4, and I was an accident. And I learned this only recently in life. And so my parents had this really nice perspective to call me Hebah, which is a gift.
Wow. So it took you, what, close to 30 years to figure out the gift meant oops.
Yeah.
Very nice. New information I'm learning about you here. Question 2. What's one thing you've bought for under $50 this year that has had a nice little impact on your life?
Like something edible?
Edible is fine. Anything.
Coffee. Coffee. My husband and I have actually this is new, we have this coffee subscription. So we're here in Seattle in the States, which is pretty big on coffee. And so every month we get 2 bags for way less than $50, but we get 2 bags of coffee that comes from roasters across the world, actually, which is super cool. So it's a really, yeah, it's great to try different kinds of coffee beans.
And it's a subscription model?
Mm-hmm.
There's a Unsettled alumni in Spain who, if she hasn't started this, she's been talking about it to me for like 6 months now. So lots of connections already. All right, one of our team's all-time favorite question, and you have to listen closely to this one. If we crushed up Hebah Fisher into a pill and we took that pill, what would we feel?
My friends in high school used to call me Prozac because I was always smiling. So that's where my mind goes. Probably, I don't know. I hope happiness.
Prozac, happiness, awesome. So you had the most literal, ready answer to that question I've ever heard. Most people get this blank stare like, what? Am I going to talk about drugs here in front of everybody? Very cool. Wow, we learned a lot about you in 3 questions. You're an accident, you're married, and you're happy. Why don't you mentioned you have both, I think, Arab and American roots. Tell us, like, what does the word home mean to you right now in 2020? Like, how would you define home, and what does it look like for you?
Home has always been a really loose concept. So, being a mixed kid, for those of you who can relate, brings a lot of existential crises, I think, about where you're from, coupled with the fact that we moved around a lot growing up, and so I spent half my childhood in the States, and then the other half in a couple of countries throughout the Gulf. And so, home is wherever my family is. It's a super, yeah, it's I think I've given up thinking that there's like one place that I'll be rooted in forever, because it just doesn't exist. And even right now, I mean, I go back and forth between Seattle and Dubai quite regularly, and so it's home is just wherever the loved ones are around me.
And right now, you and your husband are in Seattle, and your parents and siblings, are they all in Dubai?
Yeah, and the company is also in Dubai. Yeah.
He's also in Dubai. And are there loved ones at the company? I'm sure it's a product of love.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. We're a really close team.
Yeah, and on that same lines, like, how would you describe your identity to somebody who, like a friend of yours? Who is Hebah Fisher?
I consider myself Egyptian American. I am a media entrepreneur. I am the baby of the family. I'd probably start with those.
Knowing her, all those are all accurate. We first met at a conference probably exactly a decade ago on entrepreneurship. And within your identity right there, you just, shared, I think the second thing was, media entrepreneur. Where does that spirit come from? Is there somebody in your life? Why? Because as soon as I met you, I knew I knew you were and would always be an entrepreneur. Where's that come from?
It's interesting. All of us kids have done something in the startup space, either as freelancing or started their own companies or are like early hires at startups. And I don't think that was intentional, but I do think we're probably modeling after our father. My dad's always been very entrepreneurial, started several businesses, continues to start companies, even though he's meant to be retired right now. So I think it comes from just seeing our dad work so hard and always be curious about a lot of different kinds of industries. Kerning Cultures is my third company, my third startup. I've never worked for a big company before. I actually have no idea what that experience of working in corporate is like. As soon as I graduated college, I co-founded a microfinance, which is how Michael and I our first lives was in the microfinance space together. Started a microfinance and business education program in the States where I went to university. And I've always just I actually don't think that I could work for anybody else at this stage. I think I have too many opinions, and I really, really take a lot of pleasure and pride in getting to build something exactly as you envision it. So that part, yeah, I guess we get from our dad.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of folks here today are entrepreneurs, work for themselves, and it's a blessing and a curse sometimes, isn't it? Once you've been on that train, I see a lot of head nods all of a sudden. You're like, man, I don't know if I ever could work for somebody else, and that's maybe the curse, maybe not. I remember back when you were starting, this community lending program, and a lot of what I believe shaped you back then was Islamic finance, and some of, I think, the values of what you can and how you can and can't lend in Islamic finance. And I've always seen you as a values-driven, entrepreneur. And I don't know if we'll open up to be able to talk about Islamic finance today, but for anybody who hasn't come across it, I'd highly recommend you go and read about it. I first learned about it through Hebah. But how have values shown up in your business, and what has shaped those? Has it been family, religion? What else has kind of shaped the values?
Yeah, I think everything that we do at Kerning Cultures is really values driven. I mean, the impetus of starting our podcast network was based on wanting to tell more honest stories, I think, and create really good stories, but ultimately to create a media company that we could be proud of from the Arab world. And I think the desire to create a platform where we profile a lot of different kinds of voices across the region, that's a very socially driven mission as a company, and that's something that I think attracts everyone who works with Kerning Cultures. We're a team of 10 now, and a whole network of freelancers. And I think everyone that comes to us, when you listen to one of our shows, either in Arabic or in English, you can really hear, I think, the intent behind this idea of creating really powerful stories from all the places that we call home. And I think that's, I mean, the question of values, I think that's shaped, like, all of us have a similar approach, and a similar desire to be a part of what we call KC, and that comes from, I think, growing up in the Arab world. I think it comes from moving around a lot. A lot of our producers have lived in a lot of different places, and I think this desire to hopefully stimulate more empathy through stories, I think that's pretty common. And yeah, I think it's probably just more cultural than anything. Although it is something. I mean, we've done some episodes. Yeah, I'll just say that I think it's more cultural than anything.
Yeah, I think let's dive into Kerning Cultures a little bit. I went back over the weekend, and I remember thinking, like, I swear, like, about 5 years ago, I remember her first sharing somewhere in social media, like when she was first beginning to experiment with what turned into Kerning Cultures. Like, take us back to 5 years ago. So, approximately 2015. What was your impetus? Like, why did you even start a podcast? Like, how'd this come across?
Yeah, so prior to Kerning Cultures, I didn't have a background in media, and so it was a really steep learning curve. And the idea for Casey was really born out of this frustration of turning on the radio in Dubai and wanting to cry, frankly, just because so much of the content that airs on the airwaves is terrible, right? And it's not, most mainstream media in the Middle East is not created for us youth. It's created for our parents' generation. It often has a very political agenda behind it, and it's a really isolating experience, frankly. And I mean, you can extend that over to newspapers. You can extend that over to TV. It's the exact same storyline in every single musalsal, yani, we're in every single TV show. And so I wanted to tell the kinds of stories that I actually cared about, and the kinds of stories that I'd want to turn to a friend and have a conversation about. And I didn't know how to do that, but I knew that I loved podcasts. I listened to a lot of podcasts, a lot of international shows. My favorite podcast till this day is Radio Lab, which is an American podcast. And so we started with a smaller vision. It was just a single show at the time. experimented with bilingual production on a single show and learned that that doesn't work. You need to have an English show and then an Arabic show. And it took us probably 3.5 years to tell a good story, frankly. It was a lot of really, like, if I think back to some of the early interviews, like really terrible interviews, I didn't know what I was doing, horrible audio quality because we didn't have professional gear. We didn't really know how to record. And yeah, it was just a lot of botched trials, and then we got better and better, and we learned what it is that we liked. We learned, really, I think we found our voice over the 3 years, and then as we got deeper into releasing shows, we saw more of a business opportunity with what Kerning Cultures could be, and then grew into a fuller podcast network. And so a lot of that growth really happened in the past year. After we closed our seed round, we went from 1 show to 7 shows, soon to be 9 shows, and we really kind of catapulted in growth as a company since then. And our audience has been, alhamdulillah, it's been insane growth. Most of our listeners are coming from Saudi, Egypt, and the UAE. And we're also learning what kind of genres of shows do really well. So our most popular show is a show called Bihub, which is a show about love and relationships. We have another show called Jasadi, which is on body image and wellness. And the most recent season is all stories about mental health, and that's been doing really, really well. So I would say, I think the knowledge of really what works has just come from being at this for the past couple of years. But in the early days, it's pretty terrible stuff. But we needed to mess up so much to get good at it.
So, and when you say, like, you have, I think you said maybe 7 or 9 shows, you mean these are fully independently produced shows with their own names, like This American Life and Radio Lab, and then 7 more. Okay, yeah. So you're quite the media company here. Before we dive in, you mentioned a lot of interesting things there, even getting into the business a little bit. When you look at 5 years ago, over the last decade, and the US, the market I'm most familiar with, there's a lot of innovation in media. I can think back to companies that have been started in the past 10 to 15 years, like Mike is one, and plenty of others that have seemed to find a niche, and especially I think for younger audiences. Did you not see that same sort of innovation happening in the Arab and Middle East?
On social media, yes. So the Middle East tops global usage for Facebook, Snapchat, and YouTube, which is insane. If you think of, like, we're not that big of a I mean, we're 350 to 400 million regionally, but for global penetration, we top global social media usership, which is just, or usage is probably the right word. And so there's this hunger amongst, okay, so I'll take a step back. We're a majority young audience, right? So we're experiencing one of the largest youth bulges of our time in the Middle East. 65% of the region is under the age of 35. That's 140 million of us between the ages of 15 and 35. We have some of the highest smartphone penetration rates worldwide. And so those two factors kind of converging, it makes sense why we top global usage for social media. That being said, there hasn't really been, I think you're seeing, like, YouTube was its own phenomenon, right? And especially coming out of Saudi and Egypt, you're seeing an insane amount of creativity on video. Nothing was happening in the audio space. Like, when we launched Kerning Cultures, we were one of maybe 50 podcasts ever coming out of the region, and the majority of those had started in like 2006 and had released like 5 episodes, and then nothing thereafter. And so podcasts were really not a thing at all when we first launched, which was really hard, because I mean, up until maybe a year and a half ago, I would still walk into rooms and ask, do you know what a podcast is? And there was a lag on a global landscape where podcasting wasn't a thing in the Middle East until quite recently. Now, though, and for all of those factors that I mentioned in terms of how youthful we are, how digitally savvy we are, how there's a hunger for good quality content that actually is relevant, I really believe, and we at Kerning Cultures believe, that podcasting we'll top global listenership for podcasting within a few short years. And so there's a huge business opportunity here because there's very few of us who know how to produce podcasts well. But I think in terms of the media innovation in the space, I think you're seeing it in different forms, right? So there's a strong video game, there's a strong social media in general game. Audio is kind of the next frontier.
And thinking of audio, and you just, I think, laid out the landscape really well. You have all types of visual social media out there, whether it's photo, video, short video, TikTok, whatever the next thing is that I haven't heard of yet. Is there anything? Are there any opportunities with audio in the Middle East? Like you mentioned, one of your shows is on body image. To me, that there's an opportunity to do that visually, but is there anything that you can get into, I don't know, more vulnerable conversations or anything by just being audio on a topic like that? And anything specific to the culture or the region that you see is kind of a gift to work with audio?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, there's an anonymity to audio only that is really quite powerful. And so there's a lot of interviews, a lot of stories that we've done that there's no way we could have done if we came in to people's homes and into the studio with the video camera. Like Jessie, this show on body image, one of the most popular episodes actually is about women describing the first time they have sex, which is a super taboo topic, right? And there's no way in hell we would have ever been able to do that episode, which is a really beautiful, it's like a radio diary style, and things that we don't talk about in a out loud. There's no way we would have been able to do that episode if it was in video. But with audio, we were able to keep the guests anonymous. We're able, in some instances, to change the voice of the guest as well. And so there's really that layer of anonymity, and we've done that several times throughout a number of our episodes when guests are quite sensitive about having their voice be known. And there's just, I think we as Arabs, we have a really strong history of an oral tradition in general, right? Like we're the culture with hekawati, with these oral storytellers in the streets who would stand in the town squares and share these stories for hours, and this is, we see podcasts as a digital revival of this longtime tradition. And so this idea of sitting next to somebody and hearing their story and recording it orally it's a very, like, this is in our blood, and it's I think there's a much easier, we find that guests embrace the concept a lot more easily than if we came in even with a pen and a paper, I think, because we're really capturing everything, right? And it's also in their voice as opposed to us speaking on their behalf.
Wow, that's beautiful, and I can see how your team and even your brand would be so motivated for kind of a cultural revitalization, and how powerful that is. I remember something. I'm 90% sure you shared this with me. Years ago. I think I was asking you, about kind of your dual identity and about being raised in the Arab world, things that I was quite ignorant on back then, and you described it to me in a way that I found easy to understand and yet beautiful and respectful at the same time. I think you used the word, the family life is just more private in the Middle East and in the Arab world than what I as a Westerner would be used to. And is that an accurate? Did I just put words in your mouth, or do you think that's an accurate way to think about it?
No, I think it's accurate. And yeah, and so to share a little bit about how we do interviews. I mean, yes, we'll do interviews in studios, and we'll. I mean, one of the amazing things about any of the shows on Kerning Cultures is that when you listen, you'll hear voices from all over the region and all over the world, right? And so on a single episode, you'll hear, somebody from Sudan and somebody from Palestine and somebody from the UK, and I think that's quite remarkable, to have this really regional perspective within a single story. And we'll do interviews in professional studios, sure, but my favorite kind is when we go to people's homes and we'll do the interview there. And and we'll sit in the living room, and my favorite interviews often go on for like 4 hours, right? And they say that a good interview is like a good therapy session, and it's a really surreal experience because you walk in as strangers, and by the end of it, like, you really intimately know the person in front of you, and you give as much as you receive, right? So I bare my soul as much as I ask of the guests to share themselves with us. And you're having this conversation about their life story or about their life's work, or whatever the topic might be. And that kind of trust that our guests give us to welcome us into their homes, to share their story with us on tape, like, that's such a privilege and an honor. And the interview is such a sacred experience. And then to be able to take what they've given us and then reshape it in a way that that they feel at the end of the day has done their story justice is like another. I mean, it's an incredible feeling. And yes, we always care about what our audience thinks about our production, but we're always kind of waiting with bated breath to hear what the guests think of every episode. They'll send us long voice notes and essays of how much the story has really represented them and what they wanted to get across. So yeah, I think for sure, I think we're typically private, but there's also there is this. I mean, of course, that's a generalization, but Siani, there is this trust factor that is really quite special for us to be trusted to tell these stories, and I think that, yeah, that's pretty wonderful.
Have you ever had a circumstance where you or a producer walks in to say somebody's home and they're like, I'm supposed to trust you? Like, you're modern Western, hell, you probably live in the big city in the US. Like, why would I trust you? Have you ever felt the opposite happen?
So that rarely happens, actually. And a lot of that just comes down to how we conduct ourselves, I think. And I mean it when I say that we give as much as we ask of our guests. And so one of the things, and I don't do this strategically, but I mean, we always start an interview with talking about ourselves first, right? And so I'll often share stories of my family, of myself, and so that it levels the playing field, right? It's not just this instance of us asking. It's not just a one-way conversation, and I think that's key to any. Yeah, it's crazy because you have all of these people around the world that you don't really know, right? Like outside of the context of that one interview that you had with them, but you feel like you know them so well, and I think about them often, and I'll continue to message and ask about how they are, and it's really from like one. It's from one encounter. I kind of liken to if you ever gotten into a really deep conversation with somebody that you're flying with, right? Like somebody who's next to you on a plane and you never see them again. Yeah. And then it's just it's a very surreal feeling.
I think there's a quote attributed to Richard Branson, and I assume he really said it, but he said, you're told in entrepreneurship to obsess over your audience. I obsess over my team. I make sure they're happy, and they obsess over the audience. There's something kind of counterintuitive that you're saying that reminded me of that like, if you really take care of what's really important, in this case, it's the people who are revealing, these very personal stories. So probably most times, I was going to say sometimes, probably most times, if you take care of them, then maybe you're taking care of your audience by nature of that. Have you ever waded into controversy? I hear in the West, and a little bit with my experience, at least in Dubai, I hear, media is regulated. I even hear there are these words that start with the letter R that you can and can't say. There's politics left and right everywhere in the world. That's not unique, obviously, to the Middle East, but have you ever found yourself in controversy, or maybe more? I mean, do you guys cover politics? Do you shy away from it?
Yeah. So we try to stay away from politics as much as possible. That was really one of the reasons for starting Casey in the first place, was just being sick of how everything that you hear is really political, and we just wanted to focus on more stories, frankly. But yeah, so I think, I mean, censorship is obviously a reality across the region, and especially in a lot of the countries that we operate in. I would say that we we know where the lines are, right? We've been journalists now in the region. Myself, it's been close to 6 years, but for the rest of our team, it's been 10 plus years of working with different local and international outlets. And so we know what we can and cannot say. And we really have no interest in being controversial for the sake of being controversial. Like we always, if the story is not good enough, then like if it's not standalone or really gripping story, there's no need to add kind of clickbait, whatever stuff, decorative around it. That's not the point of what we do. And we really try to, everything we produce is evergreen. Everything we produce, we want for it to still be relevant 3 years down the road and still have all the makings of a really powerful story with, plot and character development and a beginning, middle, and end. And but we're also smart about the topics that we choose, right? I will say that we do push the boundaries in some instances. Like probably our edgiest show is the show Jesedi, and the episode that I shared about the first time that women have sex. We've done a show on gender fluidity, for example. Like this is stuff that is really hard to talk about, is not typically spoken about. I think we've done it in a very smart way. But we are not interested in conversations around geopolitics. We're not interested in in any poking at governments. Like that's not the point. We're a lot more interested in the human-driven stories. And to give you some examples of some of the stuff that we've produced, like we have a story about the history of the invention of the Arabic typewriter, for example, which is this really quirky historical piece. There's another episode about this, what was called the Syrian colony in New York, which I had never heard of before, but there was a huge pattern of migration from, at the time, Greater Syria to New York in the 1800s, which, like, as one of my passports is American, I had no idea that Arabs came to the US before the 1960s. And so looking at this time in history that's completely, been swept under the rug and not talked about in history books. And we have a show, which is a daily guided meditation series in Arabic, for example, short 5-minute daily guided meditation. So there's a range of content that we produce, and we're working on our first scripted fiction series, which will be an adventure thriller show, which I'm so excited about. And so we play with a lot of different kinds of genre, and within that space, like there's so much good stuff to produce that we don't need to chase the headlines, right? There's enough of that. We're a lot more focused on content that's going to last.
Yeah, super cool. I saw a question from Sarah. I'm gonna unmute her in just a second. I'll go ahead and do that. Sarah, if you still have a question, go ahead. You with us, Sarah?
Sorry, I'm here. That was an accident. I didn't mean to raise my hand. But hi, I'm a long-time fan of Kerning Cultures. I've been listening for the last 2 or 3 years, I think. It's been awesome. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm based in Saudi, and I am Saudi, so everything that you're saying really resonates.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Sarah. In just a moment, I am going to open up to questions here. One question I kind of came in with today, wanting to ask you for my own personal reasons, Hebah, you've kind of, in my mind, you already answered it. I'm going to ask it anyway to see if you think you've answered it. Do you have a formula or methodology at this point, right? You said for 3 years, it sounds like you're experimenting. Have you guys kind of maybe written down a methodology for what makes a great story in podcasting?
Yeah. So obviously, depending on the style of the show, and we've played with different kinds of formats. So we have your typical talk radio style show. We have more documentary, immersive storytelling, which is multiple interviews woven with host narration. There's music, there's sound design. It's like a full blown like radio documentary. We're playing with this fiction show. So it depends on the genre, but I would say for a good story, it's all the stuff that we learned in grade school, right? There should be a plot, there should be rising action, there should be good character development, It's awesome if there's a little twist, like an unexpected, turn at some point. There should be a resolution. And then maybe an added bonus is some kind of reflection thereafter on like, why is this very small story more meaningful on a larger scale? And ultimately our kind of bar for good characters is that by the end of it, you feel like you just had this intimate conversation with the characters, and as the listener, you feel like you really, really know these people. And then what that story is about is, again, dependent on whatever the show and whatever the theme is about. But we always try, like, we really, and I'm not saying that we hit this in every single episode that we do, but this is certainly the bar that we continually strive for, is that we never want to put anything out that's not worth our listeners' time. We'd love for it to be something that, like, you continue to think about even after you finish listening to the episode. We love creating those moments, and listeners will write in to tell us that this happens to them all the time, where they're listening to the podcast and then they arrive at their destination and they sit in the car park until they finish the episode, right? Like, we want to create those kinds of moments. And to do that, it needs to be an interesting enough story, right? And sometimes it's like a little historical lesson, and so you're listening because it's a part of history you've never heard about. And then sometimes it's, this is a full-fledged story from end to end, and I have to get to the end because I want to know what happens. So, and every episode, just for context, like, every episode goes through an insane amount of hours and an insane amount of edits. And the way that we'll produce something like a documentary is that we've pitched sessions beforehand with our team. And so everybody will pitch story ideas. We decide which ones are most interesting to go out and pursue. We'll do what we call pre-interviews. And so those are like 15-minute conversations with our guests beforehand, because sometimes this is a good character for the story, but they actually are not very articulate, which is a really sad thing to say, but that's half of it, right? Because we're really, it's their voice. And so we'll do pre-interviews. It also helps us understand, okay, what exactly can this person talk about and what dimension can they bring to the story? And then we'll put together we'll put together our interview questions. We do a ton of research before we go into any interview. And then we'll do the interview. As I mentioned, most interviews tend to be about an hour. They'll go as long as 4 hours or longer. And then we transcribe all the tape. So we have a visual to go off of, and then we highlight our favorite parts of the transcripts with minute marks for the audio. And then we'll create a script out of that goes through several drafts with the team. There's probably 4 or 5 people that touch every episode. And once we have a final script, we'll actually cut the audio based on the minute marks and the transcripts, and then record narration to weave it all together. And then our sound designer will go through another 3 or 4 drafts of the episode to put music and sound design and kind of bring everything together and bring it to life before we bring it to you. So one episode, which is maybe 30 minutes, probably goes through 50 hours of work before it gets to you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Way more work than I expected. I'm sure there's a couple of podcasters in the room who can resonate. I've certainly been on, half a dozen or a dozen podcasts before, but they're the type where they call me on Skype and they're like, "Hey, ready? And record." And then they throw it up in their podcast. And what you're doing is obviously different. It's richer, it's stories, and which is the theme this month. And you're thinking about that narrative arc. And, I couldn't help but think, somebody who has worked in film told me once, depending on the outlet of the story, it's so different from industry to industry. So she said, in like Hollywood cinema, the director has so much power. In Broadway and in-person theatrics, the actor has all the power, and the director's just in the back like, "Oh my God, is it going well?" But has a little voice once it's actually live. And in podcasting, it struck me with some things you said earlier, that the interviewer has so much power. I mean, you talked about developing rapport. It reminded me, I have a degree in anthropology, and I think maybe Susan or somebody here has a degree in anthropology as well. And like, they're so trained in developing rapport, with the interviewee, establishing that trust. And that's exactly what you talked about earlier. And I think there's so much power in that interviewer for the making of a story. But obviously, it's a huge team. How many people are on your team? We're
10 now. Yeah.
And so I want to ask 1 or 2 questions about the business, and I'd love some questions from everybody else. So we both mentioned that you're VC backed. Tell us a little bit about your business model, and why would a VC investor who's looking for big returns be interested?
Yeah, sure. So the business model for our podcast company is based on ads that we sell on the episodes. We will also license the stories. So we'll sell the rights of the audio or the story rights to other outlets. We have a branded content arm, and so that's brands hiring us to produce white label or co-branded content for them. So basically hiring us as storytellers. And then we do a bunch of trainings and consultings as well. And so that's for other publishing outlets, that's for other journalists, that's for streaming platforms that want to begin to list podcasts on their libraries. And then we have a small membership component as well. And so our content is free for listeners to listen to, but if they want to support us and make the production of these stories possible, it's like how you would pay for a Netflix or a Spotify subscription. So you can pay a monthly amount. And then we have perks that we offer members as well. So that's the business model. In terms of the interest from VCs, so podcasting as a global industry is about a $75 billion industry. In the Middle East alone, it's probably close to 6 billion as a market opportunity. I mean, it's a huge opportunity. This is, by all accounts, the future of media is podcasts. And on a global scale, you're seeing about 5 billion in mergers and acquisitions in the past 2 years alone for podcast companies, majority coming out of the US and in China. And so one example is there's a podcast network called Gimlet Media that started about 5 years ago. They raised 28 million. 6 years ago, they raised 28 million in VC funding. And then 5 years later, Spotify bought them for $230 million. And so it's there's quite a number and increasingly of examples like this. And so that was our pitch to investors, is that we're the Gimlet of the Middle East, and that we're growing, alhamdulillah, very fast. We have a really loyal and engaged audience who love our stories. And in the next couple of years, inshallah, we'll exit to a Deezer, which is the French music streaming platform, or to a Spotify for hopefully, close to that same acquisition number. So that's the pitch.
It's a pretty good pitch for all of us. Maybe you want to pull out the checkbook that is not fat enough to share with you right now. There's so many interesting things here, right? We talked about your identity. You're kind of this global third culture, though you clearly have a couple of distinct cultures. The industry that you're working in is clearly global. It's complex, a lot like, in my opinion, maybe not yours, the Middle East. Just the nature of a story is complex. When you kind of reflect back on like who you are, we shared at the top, like you've had stories featured in the American media. I don't know how much intentional that was, but like, when you think back on your life, do you just connect dots of like, wow, maybe this is exactly like what I'm meant to be doing out here?
I hope so. I mean, I've never been more fulfilled with anything that I've done before, and I can't see anything beyond Kerning Cultures. Like, this is telling stories for a living. Like, that's pretty awesome. I think this is a really wonderful convergence of a lot of. I studied anthropology in school. I've always been really intrigued by startups and building companies, and storytelling is always been. I've always written, so I love writing, and this has just been a really nice convergence. I think one thing also, actually, for those of you who know Radiolab, so the host and founder of Radiolab, Jad Amoubrad, he's a Lebanese American, and I had the like utmost honor of interviewing him for one of our shows. And he said something that really put to words this idea that I hadn't thought of. And he said, so he's similar to me in that he's half and half, right? And he said this idea of having this mixed identity actually really facilitates being a good journalist, because you're close enough that you have the empathy that's needed to have the interview, but you're not so close that you can't see the forest for the trees, right? And so I think that that is actually I think that's pretty common of the majority of our team actually at Kerning Cultures is kind of we're from, but then also a little bit globalized as citizens, and so you kind of have this balance. So yeah, I would say I think not just for me as Hebah, I think just as Kerning Cultures as a network, I think this is probably what really helps fuel the strong journalism that we're able to create.
Yeah. I'm going to go to Valerie in just a second. You've also lived and experienced the problem that you're solving, which, when I find entrepreneurs who have, lived in and are probably quite personally passionate about it. You heard the shitty radio, back home and the politics, and it wasn't for your generation, and your team is mostly female, I think mostly of the generation who you're speaking to. And I really love that. Valerie, go ahead and unmute yourself and shoot away. Thank you.
Hey there. Well, first of all, thank you for hosting this, and thank you, Hebah, for sharing your story. It's been great to hear. One of the questions I have is, as you grew and you started accepting funding and putting more of a voice out there, how did you stay true to your mission and to your own voice, to what you wanted to make of the company? Were you ever faced with decisions that you had to make that were more challenging and maybe had to change your way?
Fortunately, not anything serious. And I think that's been quite deliberate. So the first is we were very intentional about the investors that we brought on board. And so that's from the first. So sometimes when you think about accepting outside investment, there might be this push from the investor to then push the company in a direction that they want that's maybe contrary to what you want. That was never an issue because we were I would interrogate the investors just as much as they would interrogate me, right? And that's just good practice in general across any industry where you're raising capital, is that the people that you're bringing onto your cap table, the people that are joining your board, they're literally getting into bed with you, right? And so you need to make sure that these are people that you trust, that they understand what your vision is, that they're on board with your vision. And I hope that we'll be able to maintain that moving forward. I mean, all of our investors have been incredible allies and are really supportive. And then as a team, as we've grown our teams, we were 4, and then we've grown to 10. And this idea of bringing on new people, and the 4 of us had been involved with Kerning Cultures since the beginning, and so this was really the first time that we had newcomers join and be a fabric of the team, and that has been again in the interview process, just really as best as you can, which I don't have a science for how we did this, to be completely honest. I think alhamdulillah, we're just incredibly blessed that we've had amazing people join the team, but there were questions of trying to get a sense of the values of the person in front of you and the vision that they see. And one question I would always ask is, well, what do you think about media in the Arab worlds, and what role do you think that Kerning Cultures can play in that? And just to make sure that things are kind of as harmonious as they can be. I think that helps. And then the other detail about the way that we operate as a company is we're very flat as an organization. I very, very rarely, maybe once in 6 years, have I pulled the CEO card. It's been mainly that we all make decisions together. Everybody is on board with the decisions that we make. And so I think that having that space for dialogue so that everybody can share their opinion about something just helps us get to a place of consensus. So I've fortunately till now, we haven't felt this existential shift in where we need to go. But I'll tell you if that happens in the next couple of years.
How about your answer there? I can speak from my own experience of having investors and gone into that process. You didn't read that out of a book. That was directly from your own experience. And one thing that my co-founder Jonathan and I've always observed and appreciate about us is our honesty and kind of forthcomingness with investors. And several times we've answered them, I don't know, and that's the best answer we had for them. And we told them that, when we're under the pressure to in this case, get revenue or growth or whatever it is. And I look back on those answers and think that was the best thing we could have done for ourselves. Because when we get into these challenging times, it's already set that precedent that, you know what, we don't have every answer. You know, we're going to stay true to what we believe and experiment. But yeah, super good question and answer there. Thanks, Valerie. Anybody else out there with a question? Is there anything in chat? Ali from Cairo. I'll go ahead and unmute you here. In some ways, is that part of your hometown, Hebah? Go ahead, Ali.
Yeah, actually, unfortunately, it's the first time I heard about Kerning Culture. I'm sorry. I had a question about what's the typical listener that you have in mind when you are creating your content. Do you find differences between listeners across the Arab world or the Middle East?
Yeah, I think the differences would come with the genre and theme of the show, but in for the most part, our audience is quite consistent. So they're young, they're educated, and they're affluent. So the majority of our listeners are between the ages of 18 and 45. The majority have a bachelor's degree or higher. They 60% and more have a Netflix subscription, so that kind of gives you a sense of the kind of income and affluence level. 71% are female, which is pretty awesome. That's quite unique, I think, to the podcasting space in the region. And I think that just speaks to the fact that we're a majority female team, and so you can hear that in the content that we produce. So yeah, so that's our audience, and our biggest. The majority of our listeners are coming from Saudi, Egypt, UAE, Oman, Gazair, and the rest of the region.
I don't know if I'm more impressed with the stories you guys tell or your business acumen and how knowledgeable you are of your audience.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, any other questions? I have a couple to maybe kind of rapid fire. Allison, go ahead. Let me get you unmuted. Oop. Try one more time, hit that unmute button, and it's all you.
Sorry,
Gotcha.
okay. Just listening to that, that's super encouraging and inspiring, how far reaching. Do you have any desires, goals to expand that either geographically or any other way?
So our primary audience is always going to be the region. We're creating the content for ourselves first and foremost, and then we also tap into a diaspora population. So within the US, within the UK, across Europe, especially for our English language shows. So that's the core for right now. I have been speaking with some investors who are like, well, what if you take on Southeast Asia, and what if you take on Africa afterwards? And like, that sounds great. I have no idea how to do that. So I think we want to really just focus on what we know first, and then kind of dominate that, inshallah, and then looking at media networks for different geographies thereafter could be cool. I would definitely need a way bigger team and you know, reporters from all of these places, because we only know how to. I think the best storytellers are when you're really creating the content in your own taste and for yourselves. And so we would just need a much bigger team for that if we were to expand outside of the Arab region.
Thank you. Anyone else? One more question if I see a hand. Otherwise, I have one. Very cool. Well, let's wrap up on this question, Hebah. You know, what would you say is a metric for the business, but more importantly for Hebah? You know, we started kind of getting personal. We know you're an accident now. We know all of these things about you, but like looking back 10 years from now, like what's so important to you and kind of what you've created here?
I mean, one of the biggest metrics for us is downloads, and so tracking that and completion rates for episodes, those are big metrics that we're growing, alhamdulillah, really well with. I think more of a qualitative metric is just we have this channel on our team Slack called Listener Reviews, where we'll paste screenshots of messages that listeners send us, or emails that have come in, or posts on social, and that is Like if we're ever having a bad day, like that's the best channel to read. It's so lovely, the feedback that we've gotten from listeners. And so I think more qualitatively, that's a really important metric. And we hear everything from from somebody in Egypt saying that they're crying listening to the story, to somebody in the US saying, I shared this with you, Michael. One person wrote in to tell us that he binged our episodes back to back and then sold his motorcycle to fund a plane ticket to visit the Middle East for the first time, which is just like, that's extraordinary. So yeah, I think that that's a pretty important metric for us to track.
I mean, an American Male sold his motorcycle from one of your stories. That is. We had a great question here from Jaya, who I've spent time with in the UAE. Is there anything that you would change knowing what you know now, and any tips for anybody who might be getting started?
Is there anything that we would change? I think we could have, do I believe this? Maybe. I think a lot of like Kerning Cultures growth has been just like the timing, right? So the fact that podcasting are growing in popularity, the smartphone penetration, like the fact that most media sucks, like I think all of that has kind of converged into our growth. But I do think, I think we probably could have grown faster, and I think we could have gotten good at storytelling faster if we were if we had more resources as a team. So to give you a bit of insight, like the first 4 years, like my co-founder and I bankrolled Kerning Cultures. We were making very little money. And so as a result, we were a really haphazard team of volunteers mainly, who kept coming in and out. And so it was really hard to have consistency in production. And so getting to the place of knowing how to produce well, like that took a lot longer because we weren't consistent. Whereas I think that if we had, even as the business opportunity took a while to kind of catch up to the trends in the marketplace, I think we could have maybe tapped into grants or like competition funding or something else to get the capital so that we could have a more structured team so that we could iterate a lot faster. I think we could have probably shrunk that timeline. That's probably one thing that I would say.
Yeah, once again, good advice. John, you have a question? I'll get you unmuted and then we'll wrap up right after. There you are. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Hebah. We've been driving across the country and have gone through the entire archive, I think, of Kerning Cultures, and are
oh my God,
excited to drive through Lebanon, Tennessee, probably in 2 days.
Oh, dude, you should take a photo. Go to where? Did you see that Jad Abumrad and his father replanted this year? You should go check it out and take a photo and tag us.
We're gonna go make sure it's still there. So, one question I have is kind of on a broader spectrum of like, everybody and their mother is starting a podcast these days, it seems like, right? And, I'm curious from your vantage point, do you encourage that? Do you think it's still an effective way for individuals? I mean, when you don't look at it as a business, right? When you don't look at it as trying to create a multi-million-dollar company and grow it to that scale, do you think, or do you encourage people to start podcasts as an effective way for their brand, for their work? Or do you feel like it's almost too competitive now in that there's just so much out there, right? There's so much content. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, if there's things that you tell people who are, about to start something kind of on a personal level.
Yeah, for sure. So there's over 1 million podcasts out there in the libraries, which is a lot of podcasts. And so from a discovery perspective, it gets harder and harder with every new show, especially as an independent podcaster, and to not have resources behind you where you can invest in big marketing and things like that to try to get your show higher up on libraries. So that's just a reality to grapple with. I do think, just as you said, Yanni, the entry to podcasts is the barrier to entry is quite low. Anybody and their mother can start it with a smartphone, and you just record and you put it up on SoundCloud and you have a podcast. So if what I would say within that scope is very similar to what blogging was back in the day. Before you start the show, just take a serious moment to reflect on what are you bringing to the table. Because if you're just going to produce something that's like 6 episodes and then you're going to get bored of it and then drop it off, and then now there's like one other show that's cluttering these libraries, then you're like not really doing a service to anybody. Not that you owe anybody anything, but just something to consider. And the other thing that I would say is that even if and we do this with Kerning Cultures, every show that we launch, we really try to articulate what does success look like for us with that show. And so if you are producing a show that even if it's a bit more niche, but for you having 1,000 listeners a week is really all that, like, that is success, then that's amazing and you should do it. If you are like a show doesn't have to have millions of listeners for it to be considered good and successful, because those 1,000 listeners who are listening to really appreciate the content. And so I think that that's marvelous, and I think that's a great contribution to humanity.
Thank you. Speaking of libraries, let's wrap up. Can you share with us where should we find the latest episodes of Kerning Culture in English or Arabic? Where can we find them?
Yeah, you can just search your podcast apps for the Kerning Cultures. There's 7 shows that are out right now, 2 in English, 5 in Arabic. Everything from like quirky historical documentaries to a series on love. There's a folktale one called Hekayat Ramadan, which is short stories from old history books. We have a range, and they're all awesome. And then you can also follow us at Kerning Cultures on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook and get updates. And we've been doing this really cool thing, actually. That's like my favorite part of Sundays. Every Sunday we do on Instagram, on our stories, we'll do something called Kernels of Culture, which is just like the branding of that I really enjoy, like, popcorn kernels, like little kernels. And it's just like this really fun rabbit hole that one of our producers has gone down for this like cool factoid. And there's one about the origins of kushari, which is a typical dish in Egypt, to the most recent one was about the first record label in the Arab world called By the Phone. And they're pretty great. So yeah, so there's a couple of ways that you can get your you can connect with us.
Awesome. On that note, yeah, thank you so much for being here. Like I said, like when you talk business, when you talk podcasting, when you talk about the cultural depth of why you're doing this, the problem 5 years ago, it's important, it's inspiring, and hopefully it's successful. I know you feel the ups and downs all the time, as we all do, but we're all wishing you success. And on that note, why don't we all do one of my favorite things, unmute, and maybe on the kind of multiculturalism, let's say thank you in as many languages as we all know. As a goodbye to Hebah. Thank you, Hebah. Gracias.
Thanks, guys.
Ciao, ciao. Bye, everybody.
Bye.